Hello, welcome to today's webinar, 7 questions to help you on the path of testing with John Paul Varwijk. My name is Paul, I will be today's moderator. John Paul is going to present for approximately 40 to 45 minutes and that will be followed by a questions and answers session. If you want to ask a question, please type it into the control panel on your right hand side and I will ask it to John Paul. A recording of the webinar and John Paul's slides will be made available on EuroSTARconferences.com later this week. You can also join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag ESConfs. John Paul also tweets at Arborosa. And now without further delay, I'll hand you over to today's presenter, John Paul Varwijk. John Paul, you there?
I'm there.
Over to you, so.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everybody. I'm just going to start with my 7 questions webinar. But not without setting a context. My context is that most of the testers I work with are rooted in a TMAP or TMAP Next tradition, depending on how old they are. And most of my managers are actually more rooted in an ISTQB tradition of knowledge towards testing. And the organization I'm currently working in is actually moving towards Scrum. So there's some discrepancy in the views on testing, so to speak. And for me personally, I consider myself to be a context-driven tester, so that puts a nice mix of approaches into it. And based on that, I actually found myself considering what questions do I actually have when I start a test project or when I have a new work item waiting for me on a Scrum board. And I came up with these 7 questions and I'd like you to take those into consideration and I'll walk you through them. The first and foremost question is, why do I test? This is kind of a fundamental question. It's not addressing why you became a tester, but why does a project or a product need a tester? And it's something that you have to consider before you start your testing. Else, well, you might not be as prepared as you could have been. And, well, one of the more obvious reasons that many managers would state is that you are going to test because you have to find bugs. Well, I think it's so over 40 years ago that Esker Dijkstra already recognized that testing can show the presence of bugs, but not the absence of bugs. So finding bugs, yes, essential, but there must be more. And for a lot of organizations, there are also obligations to do testing. They have to fulfill a demand. It's either internal, they have their standards and processes and procedures written out, which state that any software project should have some testing, or a lot of testing in some cases. And personally, I work at a bank, so I'm very familiar with external reasons for testing, like laws, regulations. But also, more in the commercial environment, there's competition. If you want to deliver your product into the market, you want it to be suited for its purpose, without flaws, without defects. You want people to buy it eventually. So there's a reason that you go into the competition and could think that, well, maybe if I use testing, that'll help me. But probably the best reason that combines all of these is that you test to provide information. By providing information, you can address the quality of a product. And in doing so you can also identify to whom it matters. Not all stakeholders in your project will have an equal interest in the product or its qualities. It's your case to find out what they need and how they value that. And mostly also if that matters to you or not. So if I put that in the graph, I think the effort between finding bugs and providing meaningful information that matters might not be that different but the value is much higher. It tells you much more if you find a bug that you also explain why you think it is a bug and what it means to the product or what it means to the stakeholder, instead of just shouting to the developer, hey, you did it wrong. That doesn't tell you anything. You might still be compliant, but not be able to show that. So that means that providing the extra information is basically, in my opinion, essentially to figuring out why you are testing. And now that you have identified the reason for you being there as a tester and starting testing on a project, then it's your job to find out what you will test. And for a lot of people, that constitutes on what are the requirements. The requirements are not only documents. For the most part, people have been taught that they take a document, analyze it, derive test cases from it, and then execute them. But there's more. There are other sources of information that you can use to get test ideas on which you build test cases. Documents are important, and if they're available, do use them. But there are also people. Talk to the people who ask you to test in the first place, the users, your developers, your business analyst. Everybody who's involved in the product eventually has an opinion on what it should or should not do. And as a reference, there's also existing software. For the most part, I've spent my working life on developing software changes. So if I'm doing a change on a product, the history of the product and how it's used now, and it is a measure on what it is supposed to be doing. Sometimes the change is intended to overthrow the workflow, but not always. And kind of combining all those together is get a grip on the acceptance criteria. There are a lot of quality attributes you can use to define them, but mostly investigate what the stakeholders and the users actually agree upon with you. So get your acceptance criteria right. And to get a good grip on what to test, you should formulate test ideas. There's a lot to say about test ideas. Mostly that they point you in a direction. They help you to identify where to go with your testing, what techniques to use. And there's a lot of reference that I can't figure out for you. You have to figure it out yourself most of the time, because I don't know your requirements right now. But I do know that I've added 3 people that I admire. There's a group called the Test Eye with Richard Edwin, Martin Jansson, and Henrik Emilsson, who have identified a list of sources for test ideas, 37 of them, that I use regularly. There's also a heuristics cheat sheet by Elizabeth Hendrickson, James Lindsay, and Dale Emery. It is very helpful to get you started on a product that you don't know, but gets you testing it immediately. Those are all roughly related to testing mnemonics. I would urge you to Google for that, and you'll find many more of them that you can use to develop your own test ideas that are useful in your context. Eventually, test ideas lead to test cases. And even if you're context-driven like me, that does mean that you still have to know all your test techniques. You have to apply those techniques. But when doing so, bear in mind that it's wise to be as efficient as possible. So try not to repeat yourself. If you have a test, you execute that, and it tells you something about the product. You could do a similar test with just a variation on it, and it tells you something else. But you have to consider if it tells you much more or not, or if you are doing the same thing again, if it tells you anything different. So try and be as efficient in building test cases as you can. There's also, in that respect, separation of concerns to consider. That if you have a test case and you execute it, be aware that you are actually looking for a certain kind of problem that you might expect, or a certain kind of information that you try to seek. And by separation of concerns, I mean then that your test case should be able to deliver the result in such a way that you can identify that either the event that you were looking for occurred, how it went, and what that means to the product. And it should not be biased by a lot of different other outcomes during the test. And another thing that I always enjoy, especially nowadays when I do poker planning, is that I make notes of possible test cases. If anybody states something in the terminology of no user would do this, or you ain't gonna need that, that probably means that somebody has a sense of how users would interact with the product, and that might not be true. So it's something for you to consider, is that true? No user would do this. Well, if no user would do this, then make sure that he can't do that, because you probably have no code written to prevent what happens if he does it. And when you start a project, you also need to know what your context is. So you have, what questions do you have about your actual testing, well, to conduct testing. And personally, I've derived something called, what I call Jean-Paul's test. And that is that I ask myself the following questions before I start a project. Is there a testware tool? In my case, where I work now, we're heavily dependent on using HP Quality Center. And that has its own demands. That means that if I want to store my test cases, that takes a certain amount of time and structure that I might or might not like at that point. Quality Center is, for instance, not so well suited to do exploratory testing that I personally like to do a lot. So I have to consider that. That costs time. It often means that I have to adjust my workflow. A second question that you could ask yourself is, do you control the test environment that you're working in? If you are working in an environment that you have to share, you must be aware that the state of the product might not always be what you expect it to be, or that your environment is not always available. Also, you should be aware that if you're not able to control the test environment, you probably need somebody else to install stuff for you or install tooling for you. Know who they are and how you can access them and when they are available to plan your testing. The third question I ask myself is, do you control the test data? Obviously, a lot of tests that you have identified, test cases written for, you need the product to be in a certain state, or you need certain data to execute it and invoke a reaction from the product. Are you able to create that test data yourself, or do you need somebody else to do that? Can it be generated automatically, or do you have to do it manually? Can you reset the system once you have executed the test to redo it again? There are all things that you have to consider that can make life more difficult and cost time if you can't. Fourth question I ask myself is, how soon do I get my requirements? Like stated earlier, requirements are one of the starting points often for your test cases to be derived and your testing project to start. So the sooner you get them, the better it is. Preferably, you should be involved in creating the requirements. So that gets me to another questions. Are the analysts available? The people who write the requirements. Can you discuss with them? Can you ask them questions? What is their opinion of testing or testers, or of you for that matter? Once you have requirements in your project, the developers will start working on it. And a question you could ask yourself, are they available also? Because their interpretation of the requirements leads to a certain functionality build that you want to test. And if they can tell you how they make the interpretation of the requirements, that helps you to consider new test cases or help them to identify unit cases. And for that matter, considering also the acceptance criteria, you should know if the stakeholders are available or not. Those are the people who will eventually use the end product and consider it either to be valuable or not. Did it solve their problem? And for all those together, it also matters what type of personality you are. So you can ask yourself if you're working in a quiet work environment. Some people have more or less difficulty being in an open space with many people talking to each other, or the opposite, if you're working in a cubicle, that you're sitting alone, that you have to get out of your chair and walk to a developer to ask him questions if you want to. And another thing, what always is nice to formulate questions on is the Pouchmark principle. The Pouchmark principle was, I think, stated by somebody from Xabia, and what he said was that if something is too difficult to understand, it must be wrong. Your job is to prove it wrong. In my interpretation, that means that if somebody gives you an explanation or you are reading a requirement that is too difficult for you to understand or has multiple interpretations, perhaps the requirement itself should be restated and rethought. And obviously, the best advice I can give you on, if you have questions, ask them. There are a lot of questions to ask once you go on to a new project. Go out and ask them. Once you are writing test cases and doing test execution and evaluating the results and trying to convey the information to your stakeholders, consider what you already know yourself. What is your domain knowledge? In my case, I'm working at a bank. I'm doing a lot of Basel II and Basel III regulations. What do I know of those? Do I understand why the product calculates certain values for the bank and what it means to a balance sheet or to a certain stakeholder? Second one is, what is your tool knowledge? Like I said, I work with HP Quality Center. That's not too difficult, but I also work in a .NET environment. So I also have to work with Visual Studio, for instance. Do I know how to use that? And on Visual Studio, I work with SSIS packages and C#. So what do I know of those languages? What's my knowledge of the code and the query languages and SQL stuff that I use? If I'm not proficient in using that, that might hinder my execution of test cases and probably will make me think less of certain test cases because I don't know how to execute them in the first place. Things that you can already know is that if you're working on an existing application, are there existing bugs? What were the previous bugs in your test cycle? Learn from those. Those are areas where errors were made. It's not to say that the same error will occur again, but probably that was a functionality that was already difficult in the first place. So it might still be difficult now, or the solution that was used to build it was very difficult and challenging for developers. it's always good to know these kind of stuff. And what you also should know is that, like I said, we work with TMAP and Scrum. What do I know of those methodologies? What's the software development methodology the developers use? That has an influence on how they work, on how the process works. And that influences you. And now that I've stated these questions, there's no intention for me to tell you that these are sequential. Actually, in practice, what I see is that I ask myself those questions over and over again. I get answers, obviously. I take note of them, I act upon them, but things change. Especially if you're working in an agile environment, things change constantly. So you have to reconsider what information you need at what time. Once you have started testing and you are working towards providing information, there's always this big question on when am I actually done testing? When have I achieved my goal? And that's often a very difficult question to answer. Most of the time, it means that you're out of time. And that's as good as a stopping heuristic as there is, because, well, actually somebody, probably the project manager, tells you that, well, your time's up. Give me what you got, and we'll work from there. Occasionally I've been on a project where somebody stated, okay, it's great that you put so much effort into it, but we have come up with another solution, and we'll stop right now, so your mission is revoked. That's not often, luckily. The third one is one that is your mission is accomplished, and that's very difficult to get to. Actually, I seriously doubt that it'll ever happen for real, because as a tester I always feel I can do more stuff. But my stakeholders might think that, okay, I've seen the product working, I had your information, I feel confident that we can go live with this project. We think that your mission is accomplished. You have given us enough information. We have made a decision. The product is going live. You're done. The fourth reason might be that something that I have had the luck not to encounter too often is that it's done according to protocol or procedure. I have been in a project where somebody stated that we need 1,000 test cases, and eventually the test team wrote 1,200 test cases. That didn't necessarily mean that they were good test cases. That only meant that they were 1,200 and that they told you something, but not a lot. But eventually we executed all those 1,200 test cases. And we had a lot of defects. They were solved, they were retested, and eventually we came to a state where in the defect meeting the project manager noted, okay, we have no more critical defects. We have like 2 defects that have a medium category and the rest is low. By my standard, we're done. That didn't mean that I felt comfortable that we were going live. That just meant that he had an agreement with the stakeholders that once a certain amount of test cases were executed and no more critical defects were there and less than 5 medium level defects were there, that there was no problem anymore. So we went live. And the final one to identify when you have achieved your goal is that there are no more interesting questions. That is, you are out of test ideas. And perhaps maybe even your team is out of test ideas. You can't think of anything else to test. There might be a lot more to test. You don't know. But for you, this might mean that, okay, maybe I should hand over my testing now and let somebody else have a go at it. Or have a discussion with your project manager and say, okay, this is what I did. This is what I thought should be done, and I have done it all. I can't think of anything else. And there are no more defects that I think should be fixed. So are we done? Is likely to be there. And I suppose that if you have more experience, the period to get to a point that you have no more interesting questions is longer. But you might consider it that if your test ideas keep on repeating themselves, maybe you don't have any real new questions. Maybe you should contact another tester. Maybe you should hand over to another group of testers. You have to be realistic about that. But as I said, most of the times that I'm working at a project, eventually the out of time heuristic is probably the most used. And once you've done testing, either at the end of a project or the end of an iteration or an end of a sprint or after you finished a singular piece of functionality, you have to be able to tell what you have tested. So the what I have tested, what have I tested question is very important. In the end, it is how you convey your information to the outside world. One way to do that is to make sure that you keep your test very clean. And what I mean by that is that when you start testing, you should already have an idea on how you will organize your test plan. How do you create traceability between your test case and the requirements? Where do you store the requirements? Where do you store your test cases? Sometimes the tool tells you how to do it. Most likely the tool has a certain amount of liberty in how you do that. So some standard or procedure might tell you, but you have to be aware that even then, if there is something that tells you how to do it, you have to make sure that you actually do that. You actually create traceability and links between stuff. That if somebody asks you, oh, did you test that? You said, yeah, I tested that with these and this test case. And I can show you the test execution for that also. But more interestingly, I can also show you what the result of the execution was and how I felt about it and what the defects were. And this brings back into it. And in the end, it's also about the ability to provide the information to your customers and stakeholders so that they are able to take that decision. So you have your testware, you have your results, you have your ideas on what the results mean. You should be able to build a report up on that. Get yourself an elevator pitch if the manager comes and asks, okay, so where are we? Be able to state in a short and brief way what you did, what you think the result is, and what it means to the person asking you the question. Be also able to convey that in a document and to elaborate that in a presentation if you need to. This is actually one of the skills I think a lot of testers have problems with. They have a lot of skills in using tooling. They are proficient in using test techniques, although a lot of them have probably their own favorites. They do testing, they get results, they find defects, and they get fixed, but they're not able to actually tell what they did in the end. You have to be able to tell your testing story. And for the last part also is that it matters in your testware that you do not deliver a black box result. Very often when I review testware from other testers, I see a test case, I kind of know the requirement, and I have no idea what they tested. There is, for instance, a case where I was reviewing testing of a data warehouse. Somebody had wrote a lot of SQL queries for that. I could have a look at the query, and I thought, okay, yeah, you're making assertions there. I kind of get it, but what were you actually testing? And then the result only showed okay or not okay. That doesn't tell me anything. And in my environment where there's a high demand on regulations, you actually get in trouble if you can't explain why stuff has an interpretation or not. The changes that you test have to be acknowledged. So what do you do for test? What does it mean? What does it mean to the change, for instance? That's what, for instance, SOX compliance means. So in that case, your test should be possible to be audited. Use meaningful descriptions and make sure that you have yourself a distinction between the features you tested. Were they functional, were they non-functional? What does it mean? Was it a link to a work item or not? That's the thing that you want to be able to show in the end. And that's the thing. Those are also the things that stakeholders, users, customers need to take a decision. Here are a few examples of what is used in my company currently. The one on the left side is probably the most elaborate one and the most traditional one, based on an old standard which lets you write a complete report. It's not that often used anymore. Nowadays, a lot of stakeholders are satisfied if you can supply a kind of a matrix like the one in the right upper corner. And if I need to show progress, I often use mind maps myself that show a kind of coverage and results. And at some point you might have a feeling that, well, I don't know anymore. What if I don't know how to go further? Well, rest assured, you will not be the first tester that doesn't know what to do at some point during a project. And there's something that I learned early on from my developers, is that I was talking to him and I asked him, how does it work? How come you know so much about Java structs a long time ago? And he said, well, it's very easy. I don't know that much. But I have this very thick book which supplies me with 2,000 examples. And furthermore, I have internet. So if I have, what I should be able to do is to consider what my problem is, state it in such a way that I can Google it, and it tells me a solution. Based on that example, I can then derive my own solution. So for testers alike, consider that if you're testing a new application that you don't know that much about, chances are that somebody else has already tested that kind of application before. See if you can find information about how they tested it, or you can find somebody who tested it so you can contact them. And it's also my second about contact your test community. There are a lot of testers out there. It might be in your own company, or on Twitter, or on the internet following blogs. Go to meetups. You can talk about problems you have or problems you face with getting test cases right, or getting them executed, or complying to your test strategy or reporting about it. Just ask. And also, often it is enough that you do what you think is right and not just what you're told to do or told not to do. And finally, ask for help if you need it. That kind of concludes my presentation. So I'll hand over to Paul now to get the questions.
Thanks, John Paul.
You're welcome.
We will take any questions now from anybody who wants to put a question to John Paul. There's one actually coming through already. It's from Rainer Dewson. What tool was used to create the mind maps?
The tool I used to create the mind map was a Busan tool, iMindMap, which I actually don't use anymore, but that's mostly because of the price.
Okay, there's another question from a Neil Findlay. Neil says he's enjoying the presentation. Would you consider an 8th question? What could I have done better? I think the opportunity for continuous improvement is a key when engaged on a piece of work.
Well, Neil, yeah, that's certainly a question you should ask yourself. And I could consider adding that to my 7 questions, although I'm pretty comfortable being that it are 7. But the question, what could I have done better, is certainly one that you have to ask yourself regularly. And it's even something that is kind of a standard if you're working Agile, that you do a retrospective where you ask yourself what went well and what did not go so well, or what could be done better. You could ask yourself that on a personal level also. And maybe it's more challenging not to ask that to yourself, but to ask others to review your work and tell you what they think of what you did. So there certainly is a point in going for that question.
Okay, if there are any more questions, please type them into the control panel and I will put them to John Paul. Just while we're waiting for questions to come through there, I'll just remind anyone who's hoping to speak at EuroSTAR Conference 2013 in Gothenburg, the deadline for call for submissions is February 13th, which is just 2 weeks from today. We have another question coming through here from Alexis Tulonen. How would you figure out what information you share? Why do you share and how do you share? I find this as a challenging problem that is hugely context dependent.
Hi Alexis. Well, you're completely right there. That is really context dependent. And even so context dependent that it's context dependent on a personal level. You yourself have ideas on what you should share. You have an opinion as a tester. That's probably the reason that you chose certain test ideas over other test ideas in the first place. So you gain certain kind of information. How to share that with other people is often a challenge. For instance, I have different approaches based on the fact if people are developers or business analysts or project managers or business user or senior user. And that is not that my information is necessarily always that different, but there's a difference in how I convey that. And well, I'm working in an Agile team. The developers are sitting next to me, so I can just pat them on the shoulder and tell them something or ask them something. So that's very easy to convey the information with them. Business analyst is also within my team, but often also engaged with stakeholders. So they are a bit more remote, and they also communicate on other stuff. With a developer, I can talk shop kind of on code and how he built the function that he has built in that I am testing. With the business analyst, obviously I have to discuss more on the requirement level. So if I have questions for him, or I tell him a result from my test that has, I believe, an impact on requirement, then I'm going not to argue that that it doesn't work in a certain function class or method or whatever. No, I'm telling him that, okay, in this scenario there's an instance or a state that you have not given me a description for, or there's an exception to that. Could you have a look into that? Can we discuss that? So that's more on a requirement level. Obviously my project manager is more often interested in my progress and my planning, and where do I spend my time on. Sorry. And when the project would be ready to deliver a shippable product, that means that he wants to know different information. I have to figure that out, what he actually needs. I've been on a project that is a follow-up on the same product, and I've had my third project manager, I think, and they're all different. So I have to figure out what he personally likes, what his style is. And for senior users, it's actually the same. You have to figure out, preferably in advance, what they want from the product, what their needs are, what problem it solves. So that is a good directive in the information that you want to supply to them. But also you have to figure out what their place is in your organization, or in the organization where you develop your stuff for. There are some stakeholders that actually don't like to be talking to testers and expect project managers to convey messages. So you have to apply a different approach. So it's very context dependent on how your organization is built up, how you're situated physically even, and also on a personal level, how do they communicate? What's their communication style? My company has, I think for a couple of years now, invested in identifying people's communication styles and making everybody aware of it. That all the styles that were identified are published on the internet site. So you know, if I'm going to talk to somebody that I actually don't talk to a lot, I can have a peek and see, well, how does that match to my personal style? Maybe I should adjust the way I deliver the message. And that's basically my approach on how to deliver information.
Another question here. Yeah, there's a question from Simon Berner. Do you always use test cases to prove the traceability, or do you have other ways to do that?
Currently in my context, I have to use test cases. That's the regulated way to link testing to requirements. But I also test outside of work. And in that case, I probably would deliver the story more and tell them what I have tested and what it means to the product or a certain piece of the product or function. Personally, I think using test cases is a way to limit yourself and to steer yourself in using testing techniques and being aware of differences between looking for certain problem areas or not. But that's more a personal style. So I don't think it's always necessary. I don't even think that there is a prescriptive way on how to write or construct test cases. But personally, I often do, even if I do them on the fly. I actually do that most of the time. So I hope that answers the question, Bernie.
Another question here from Slava Bulba.
If you hear any noise in the background.
That's okay. That's okay, John Paul.
Yeah, well, if you hear any noise in the background, my children are coming home from school. Yes. And they are aware that I'm online, but that doesn't always necessarily mean that they're quiet.
Not a problem, not a problem. What tools do you use? QC only, maybe Jira, that's Jira. And then as a follow-on question, what model do you follow in a bank? Agile, waterfall, or something else?
Well, we're currently in a move with tooling respect. Internally, the bank has still the standard that we use HP Quality Center, but we're moving this year to Microsoft Test Manager because the test development is being changed towards using a Team Foundation system, and Microsoft Test Manager links up better to Team Foundation system and to the outside world, where you have to communicate outside of my intranet. I often use Jira, so I use anything. You can use Excel if you want to. It doesn't really matter. Probably if you want to convey test cases and defects and bugs and stuff like that, it's best to have an upfront agreement on it and make sure that you tell the whole story. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, John Paul. We'll take one more question here from Roy Smith. Do you provide estimates on how long you will need to spend on testing? If so, what do you find to be the most useful reference in estimating?
That's actually a difficult question. I've been in testing for quite a few years now. And when I started, I thought that giving estimates was obvious. You had to do planning. So if I wrote down my test plan and I got a test strategy, obviously there had to be a chapter in there with planning. Over the years, I've come a bit wiser and found that, well, I can make as much plans and estimates as I like, but they're likely never to be true. So I do give estimates, but I always say that they're very high level, and preferably nowadays I work in an agile context, so when we do POCA planning, we actually only give POCA points, and the POCA points are on a work item, and the work item, the POCA points then describe the effort or difficulty for the whole of the team, including testing, development, and requirements solicitation. So yes, I do give estimates. I'm not very comfortable giving estimates. I don't think they have a very high value other than to have an idea of how long stuff might take. Personally, I think on the long term you should have an idea on how development should be proceeding, and on the short term you can only give high-level estimates. And probably if I start testing on a item or a function, I can give you a more accurate estimate, but the question is, would that really help you? So yeah, it's very difficult. I know that there are a lot of industry standards saying stuff like for every development hour there's one testing hour, or for every development hour there's half a testing hour, or you can do function point analysis. Personally, I think that they're generally a waste of time. And you should be aware of time, you should be aware of deadlines, you should be aware of where others are while testing. You should adjust your efforts and the things you test to each other, but giving estimates on the whole.
Okay, thanks, John Paul.
So that was my answer.
We'll leave it there. I think we've been through all of the questions, but if there are any other questions from any of the attendees, I'm sure John Paul will be happy to answer them on Twitter. You'll get them at Arborosa. This webinar, along with over 50 others, will be available on the EuroSTAR website, eurostarconferences.com. Visit the community section of the website to access those. This webinar has now concluded. Thanks to John Paul and to all who attended today's session, and have a nice day.
Have a nice day, everybody.